Sarah Martinez clutched her worn leather bag tighter as she approached the security checkpoint at the federal building. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the marble floor. Her appointment with the immigration attorney was in 20 minutes, and she couldn't afford to be late. This meeting could determine whether her younger brother Miguel would be allowed to stay in the country. The line moved slowly. Sarah watched as each person ahead of her placed their belongings on the conveyor belt, walked through the metal detector, and collected their items on the other side. It seemed routine enough. When her turn came, she lifted her bag onto the belt and stepped toward the detector. "Ma'am, step back, please." The voice belonged to Officer Reynolds, a tall man with graying temples and sharp blue eyes. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished to a shine. Sarah retreated, confusion flickering across her face. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her English careful and measured. She had practiced these words countless times, knowing that any misunderstanding could escalate quickly. Officer Reynolds didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured to his colleague, a younger officer named Thompson, who began examining the X-ray screen more closely. Sarah's bag sat motionless on the belt, and she felt her heart rate increase with each passing second. "We need to inspect your bag," Reynolds announced, pulling it from the machine. His movements were deliberate, almost theatrical. Other travelers in line began to take notice, some craning their necks to see what was happening. Sarah nodded, though inside she felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. She had been through situations like this before, where routine procedures somehow became complicated when you looked like her. When your accent marked you as different, when your documentation told a story of struggle rather than privilege. Reynolds placed her bag on a metal table nearby and began removing items one by one. First came her appointment folder, containing copies of Miguel's school records, character references from his teachers, and letters from community members who knew him. Reynolds flipped through these documents with casual indifference, as if they were merely pieces of scrap paper rather than carefully assembled evidence of a young man's worth. Next came her wallet, which Reynolds opened and examined thoroughly. He counted her cash slowly, making note of the amount in a small notebook. Sarah had exactly $63, money she had saved from her job cleaning office buildings downtown. Every dollar represented hours of work, early mornings, and sore muscles. "Where did this money come from?" Reynolds asked, holding up the small stack of bills. "I work cleaning offices," Sarah replied. "I can show you my pay stubs." Reynolds grunted but didn't seem interested in her offer. He continued his examination, pulling out her employee ID card, a photo of Miguel at his high school graduation, and a small religious medallion that had belonged to her mother. The medallion caught Reynolds' attention. He held it up to the light, turning it over in his palm. It was a simple piece, depicting St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. Sarah's mother had pressed it into her hand the night before she crossed the border 15 years ago, when Sarah was barely 18 and desperate to escape the violence that had claimed her father's life. "What's this?" Reynolds demanded, as if the small piece of silver posed some sort of threat. "It's a religious medal," Sarah explained. "From my mother." Reynolds set it aside and continued rifling through her belongings. He found her phone, which he examined closely, though he didn't turn it on. He discovered a small packet of tissues, a pen that barely worked, and a piece of gum wrapped in foil. By now, the line behind Sarah had grown longer. People were checking their watches, tapping their feet, and whispering among themselves. Sarah felt their eyes on her, felt the weight of their impatience and judgment. She wanted to disappear, to be anywhere but standing there while this man systematically violated her privacy in front of strangers. Officer Thompson, who had been quietly observing, leaned closer to Reynolds. "Sir, the X-ray didn't show anything unusual," he said in a low voice. Reynolds waved him away with irritation. "I'll be the judge of that." Sarah glanced at the clock on the wall. 15 minutes until her appointment. The attorney had been very clear that punctuality was important, that immigration judges didn't appreciate delays or excuses. This meeting was supposed to be a formality, a final review of Miguel's case before his hearing next month. Miguel was 22 now, brought to the country when he was 7 years old. He had grown up here, graduated high school with honors, and was working toward a degree in engineering at the community college. He volunteered at a local food bank and coached soccer for younger kids in their neighborhood. By every measure that mattered, he was American, but the law didn't see it that way. Reynolds continued his search, becoming increasingly aggressive in his handling of Sarah's belongings. He shook out her folder, allowing some papers to scatter on the floor. He squeezed her wallet as if expecting something to fall out. He examined the lining of her bag with unnecessary thoroughness. "Are you carrying anything illegal?" he asked suddenly, his voice sharp and accusatory. Sarah felt her face flush. "No, sir. Nothing illegal." "No drugs? No weapons? No false documents?" Each question felt like a slap. Sarah had worked hard to build a life here, to follow every rule, to never give anyone a reason to question her right to exist in this space. She paid her taxes, obeyed the law, and contributed to her community. Yet here she was, being treated like a criminal for the simple act of trying to enter a government building. "No, sir," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Reynolds seemed disappointed by her answers. He had clearly expected to find something, anything, that would justify his aggressive search. When it became obvious that Sarah's bag contained nothing more threatening than the ordinary possessions of a working woman, his frustration became visible. "Why are you here today?" he demanded, as if her presence in the building was inherently suspicious. "I have an appointment with an immigration attorney," Sarah replied, "for my brother's case." This information seemed to energize Reynolds. His eyes lit up, with a kind of predatory interest, as if he had finally found the angle he was looking for. "Immigration attorney?" he repeated, loud enough for others in line to hear. "What kind of case?" Sarah felt trapped. She didn't want to discuss Miguel's situation in front of all these strangers, but she also knew that refusing to answer would only make things worse. "My brother was brought here as a child," she explained carefully. "We're trying to help him adjust his status." Reynolds nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he had already made up his mind about Sarah and her brother. In his eyes, she could see the assumption that they were probably here illegally, probably taking advantage of the system, probably not deserving of the opportunity to call this country home. The truth was more complicated, as it always was. Sarah had crossed the border without documentation 15 years ago, fleeing violence and poverty that most Americans couldn't imagine. But she had built a life here, learned the language, found work, and eventually obtained legal status through a program for crime victims after she helped police arrest the man who had assaulted her supervisor at work. Miguel's situation was different. He had been brought by their older cousin when their hometown became too dangerous for children. Their parents had died in a car accident when Miguel was 5, and their cousin had made the heartbreaking decision to bring him north, rather than leave him in an orphanage where his safety couldn't be guaranteed. For 15 years, Miguel had lived in legal limbo, protected by various programs and policies but never quite achieving the security of permanent status. The current political climate had made his situation more precarious, but their attorney was confident that his case was strong. None of this mattered to Reynolds, who seemed to view Sarah's explanation as confirmation of his suspicions, rather than a human story deserving of compassion. "Stand right here," he commanded, pointing to a spot near the wall. "Don't move." Sarah obeyed, though she didn't understand why she was being detained. Her bag contained nothing illegal or dangerous. She had answered all of his questions truthfully. She had done nothing wrong except exist in a space where her presence was apparently unwelcome. Reynolds walked over to a phone mounted on the wall and made a call. Sarah couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could see him gesturing in her direction. Her anxiety increased with each minute that passed. 10 minutes, until her appointment. 9 minutes. 8. Other travelers continued to pass through the checkpoint, their own screening processes moving quickly and efficiently. Sarah watched a businessman in an expensive suit walk through without even removing his laptop from his bag. A woman with designer luggage chatted pleasantly with Thompson as her belongings were processed. An elderly man with a thick accent was helped courteously when he seemed confused by the procedure. The difference was stark and impossible to ignore. Sarah's treatment had nothing to do with security protocols and everything to do with who she was and where she came from. Thompson approached her while Reynolds continued his phone conversation. "Ma'am, I'm sorry about this," he said quietly. "Officer Reynolds is just being thorough." Sarah appreciated the young officer's attempt at kindness. but she could see the discomfort in his eyes. He knew this wasn't normal procedure. He knew she was being singled out unfairly. But he also knew that challenging his senior officer could jeopardize his own position. "How much longer will this take?" Sarah asked. "I have an important appointment." Thompson glanced over at Reynolds, who was still on the phone. "I'm not sure. Just try to be patient." Patience. Sarah had been patient for 15 years. Patient while waiting for immigration reform that never came. Patient while watching friends and neighbors disappear into detention centers. Patient while working jobs that paid less than minimum wage because employers knew she couldn't complain. Patient while being treated as less than human by people who had never walked in her shoes. Reynolds finally hung up the phone and returned to where Sarah was standing. His expression was grim, as if he had received bad news. "We're going to need to do a more thorough search," he announced. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. A more thorough search could only mean one thing, and the thought of it made her stomach turn. She had heard stories from other women, whispered conversations about the humiliation and violation that came with certain types of searches. She had hoped never to experience it herself. "What kind of search?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "A physical search," Reynolds replied, his tone suggesting he was enjoying her discomfort. "We have reason to believe you might be carrying contraband." "What reason?" Sarah's voice was stronger now, fueled by a combination of fear and growing anger. "You've already searched my bag. You found nothing suspicious. What possible reason could you have?" Reynolds smiled coldly. "You're being evasive. Your story doesn't add up. And frankly, people like you often try to smuggle things into federal buildings. People like you." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah felt something shift inside her, a transformation from fear to fury. She had endured years of subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination. But this was different. This was a government employee, in a federal building, openly expressing prejudice that should have been unthinkable in a country built on principles of equality and justice. "What exactly do you mean by people like me?" she asked, her English suddenly crystal clear despite her accent. Reynolds realized he had said too much, but instead of backing down, he doubled down on his hostility. "People who come here illegally and think they can demand the same rights as citizens." The checkpoint area had grown quiet. Other travelers were no longer pretending not to watch. Thompson looked mortified. His face flushed with embarrassment at his colleague's behavior. Even the other security officers seemed uncomfortable with the direction this interaction was taking. Sarah felt a strange calm descend over her. She had spent 15 years trying to make herself smaller, less threatening, more acceptable to people who would never fully accept her, regardless of how perfectly she behaved. But standing there, facing this man's naked hostility, she realized that no amount of compliance would ever be enough for someone who saw her as inherently unwelcome. "I have legal status," she said clearly. "I work here legally. I pay taxes here legally. And I have the right to be treated with the same dignity as any other person in this building." Reynolds scoffed. "Rights? You think you have rights? You're here at our discretion. And if you don't like the way you're being treated, you can go back where you came from." The words echoed through the checkpoint area like a gunshot. Several people gasped audibly. Thompson stepped forward as if to intervene, then stopped himself, clearly torn between doing what was right and protecting his career. Sarah stood straighter, drawing on a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I am exactly where I came from," she said, her voice carrying despite its quiet tone. "I came from a place where people are killed for speaking out against injustice. I came from a place where women are treated as property. I came from a place where children go to bed hungry because corrupt officials steal money meant for schools and hospitals. And I came here because I believed America was different. I believed it was a place where people could build better lives through hard work and determination." She paused, looking directly into Reynolds' eyes. "I still believe that, despite people like you who seem determined to prove me wrong." The checkpoint had become completely silent except for the humming of the X-ray machines and the distant sounds of the building's ventilation system. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her, but for the first time in years, she didn't care who was watching or what they might think. Reynolds' face had turned red with anger and perhaps embarrassment. He was clearly unaccustomed to being challenged, especially by someone he viewed as beneath him in the social hierarchy. His response was predictably aggressive. "That's it," he snarled. "You're coming with me for a full-body search. And after that, we're calling immigration to check your status." He reached for Sarah's arm, intending to physically escort her to a private room where she would be subjected to the kind of search that was designed as much to humiliate as to find contraband. Sarah instinctively pulled back, not wanting this angry man to touch her. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice sharp with warning. "You don't get to make demands," Reynolds replied, reaching for her again. That's when Thompson finally found his voice and his courage. "Officer Reynolds," he said, stepping between Sarah and his superior, "I think we need to reconsider this situation." Reynolds turned his glare on the younger officer. "Excuse me?" Thompson's voice shook slightly, but he pressed on. "Sir, I've reviewed the X-ray images again. There's no indication of any contraband. The bag search revealed nothing suspicious. And I don't think we have legal justification for a body search based on what's happened here. Are you questioning my judgment, Thompson?" "I'm questioning whether we're following proper procedure." The standoff between the two officers created a moment of suspended tension. Sarah could see Thompson's hands trembling slightly, could see the sweat beading on his forehead. She realized that this young man was risking his job to protect her from something that was clearly wrong, even if it might be technically legal. Reynolds looked around the checkpoint area, suddenly seeming to notice that their conversation had drawn an audience. A woman with a smartphone, held discreetly at her side, appeared to be recording. A man in an expensive suit was taking notes in a small notebook. Several people were watching with expressions of disgust and disapproval. For the first time since this ordeal began, Reynolds seemed to realize that his behavior might have consequences beyond this moment. Federal buildings were public spaces, and in the age of social media, incidents like this could become viral videos within hours. "Fine," he said finally, though his tone suggested he was anything but fine with the situation. "But I'm filing a report about this incident. And you," he pointed at Sarah, "are going on a watch list. Don't expect to walk through here easily again." Sarah felt a mix of relief and continued anger. She had avoided the immediate humiliation of a body search, but Reynolds' threat about a watch list was deeply concerning. Such lists could make her life much more difficult, could impact her ability to access government services, could even affect Miguel's case. "On what grounds?" she asked. Reynolds smiled nastily. "Suspicious behavior. Evasive answers. Potential security risk." Thompson looked stricken. He had prevented one injustice, but he couldn't prevent Reynolds from filing a report that could follow Sarah for years to come. The system was designed to protect officers who made accusations, even when those accusations were clearly motivated by bias, rather than legitimate security concerns. Sarah gathered her scattered belongings, her hands shaking slightly as she returned items to her bag. The religious medallion felt warm in her palm as she tucked it back into her wallet. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, words of strength and resilience that had carried her through countless difficult moments. As she prepared to leave the checkpoint area, Sarah turned back to face Reynolds one more time. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "I want your badge number and your supervisor's name," she said. Reynolds laughed harshly. "You think anyone's going to care about your complaint? You think your word means anything against mine?" "I think," Sarah replied quietly, "that you might be surprised by how many people care about justice, even when it involves someone like me." Thompson, emboldened by Sarah's courage, stepped forward again. "Officer Reynolds, you're required to provide that information when requested." Reynolds glared at both of them, but protocol was protocol, even when he clearly didn't want to follow it. He grudgingly recited his badge number and the name of his supervisor, which Sarah carefully wrote down in a small notebook she kept in her bag. As she finally walked away from the checkpoint, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. She was relieved to be free from Reynolds' hostile attention, but she was also acutely aware that this incident was far from over. The threat of being placed on a watch list hung over her like a dark cloud, and she knew that Reynolds would likely make good on his promise to make her future visits to this building as difficult as possible. But she also felt something she hadn't expected, a sense of pride. For the first time in years, she had stood up for herself in the face of blatant discrimination. She had refused to be intimidated into silence. She had spoken her truth, even when doing so carried real risks. The clock on the wall showed that she was now 10 minutes late for her appointment with the immigration attorney. Sarah hurried through the building's corridors, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She hoped the attorney would understand the delay, would still be able to meet with her despite her lateness. As she reached the elevator bank, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Thompson approaching at a quick pace. "Ma'am," he called softly. "Wait." Sarah stopped, uncertain whether this was another complication or something else entirely. Thompson reached her, slightly out of breath. He glanced around to make sure they weren't being observed, then spoke in a low, urgent voice. "What happened back there wasn't right," he said. "Officer Reynolds was out of line. And I want you to know that not all of us think like he does." Sarah studied the young officer's face, seeing genuine remorse and concern in his eyes. "I'm going to file my own report," Thompson continued, "about what I witnessed. It might not carry much weight compared to a senior officer's word, but it's the right thing to do." "Thank you," Sarah said simply, touched by this unexpected act of integrity. Thompson nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "There's something else you should know. Officer Reynolds has been problematic before. There have been other complaints, though none that led to serious consequences. But if you do file a formal complaint, you won't be alone." This information gave Sarah a glimmer of hope. Perhaps Reynolds's behavior was well documented enough that one more incident might finally result in meaningful accountability. "I appreciate you telling me that," she said. Thompson glanced around again, then pulled out his phone. "I'm going to give you my contact information. If you need someone to corroborate what happened today, I'll tell the truth about what I saw." As Sarah entered the attorney's phone number into her phone, she felt a small restoration of faith in human decency. Thompson's willingness to speak truth to power reminded her that not everyone in positions of authority was like Reynolds. There were still people who believed in justice, even when standing up for it required personal courage. The elevator arrived, and Sarah stepped inside. As the doors began to close, Thompson spoke one more time. "Good luck with your brother's case," he said. The elevator rose slowly through the federal building, each floor marking Sarah's transition from victim to advocate. By the time she reached the attorney's office on the 8th floor, she had made several important decisions about how she would respond to what had just happened. Attorney Rebecca Chen was waiting in her office doorway when Sarah emerged from the elevator. A petite woman in her 40s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, Chen had built her career defending immigrants' rights and had seen enough injustice to recognize its aftermath in a client's face. "Miss Martinez," she said gently, "are you all right? You look shaken." Sarah took a deep breath, then recounted the entire checkpoint incident, while Chen listened with growing concern and occasional nods of recognition. When Sarah finished her account, the attorney was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry that happened to you," Chen said finally. "Unfortunately, what you experienced isn't uncommon, though that doesn't make it any less wrong." They spent the next hour reviewing Miguel's case. But Sarah found it difficult to concentrate on the legal details when her mind kept returning to Reynolds' threats about watch lists and future harassment. Finally, Chen set aside the case files and addressed the elephant in the room. "Sarah, I need to ask you something important. Do you want to file a formal complaint about Officer Reynolds' conduct?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah knew that filing a complaint could bring unwanted attention to her family, could potentially complicate Miguel's case, could make her a target for retaliation, but she also knew that staying silent would allow Reynolds to continue treating other people the way he had treated her. "What would happen if I file a complaint?" she asked. Chen explained the process. Formal documentation, potential investigations, possible disciplinary action against Reynolds, but also the likelihood of pushback and attempts to discredit Sarah's account. It would not be an easy path, and there were no guarantees of meaningful consequences for the officer. On the other hand, Chen continued, Thompson's willingness to file a corroborating report could make a significant difference. And if there are other complaints against Reynolds, your case might be the one that finally tips the scales toward accountability. Sarah thought about Miguel, about the thousands of other immigrants navigating a system that seemed designed to dehumanize them, about the woman with the smartphone who had been recording, about Thompson's quiet courage in speaking up. Yes, she said finally, I want to file a complaint. Chen smiled with approval. I think you're making the right choice. And I want you to know that our firm will represent you in this matter at no charge. What Officer Reynolds did was a clear violation of your civil rights, and we have experience holding government officials accountable for that kind of misconduct. Over the next 2 hours, Chen helped Sarah draft a detailed complaint that documented every aspect of her encounter with Reynolds. They included Thompson's contact information and made note of the potential witnesses who had observed the incident. Chen also arranged for Sarah to meet with a civil rights organization that specialized in cases involving discrimination by federal employees. As they worked, Sarah felt a growing sense of empowerment. For years, she had accepted mistreatment as the price of being allowed to remain in the country. But Chen helped her understand that having legal status meant having legal rights, and that those rights were meaningless unless people were willing to fight for them. There's something else we should discuss, Chen said, as they prepared to conclude their meeting. Your case has the potential to become high profile. Civil rights organizations are always looking for clear examples of government discrimination to highlight systemic problems. Are you prepared for that kind of attention? Sarah considered the question carefully. Publicity could bring both support and backlash. It could amplify her voice or make her a target for people who shared Reynolds' prejudices, but it could also prevent other people from experiencing what she had endured. If it helps other people, then yes, she said. 2 days later, Sarah's complaint was formally filed with the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General. Thompson had already submitted his own report, just as he had promised, and his account corroborated every detail of Sarah's version of events. Within a week, the story had attracted attention from local media. The woman with the smartphone had indeed been recording, and portions of the incident were now circulating on social media. The video clearly showed Reynolds' aggressive behavior and captured audio of his most damaging statements, including his "people like you" comment. The response was swift and multifaceted. Civil rights organizations rallied to Sarah's cause, using her case to highlight broader patterns of discrimination in federal law enforcement. Community groups organized peaceful demonstrations outside the federal building, demanding accountability and policy changes. But there was also pushback. Sarah began receiving threatening phone calls and emails from people who viewed her complaint as an attack on law enforcement. Someone spray-painted a crude message on her apartment building's wall. A conservative blog published an article questioning her legal status and suggesting she was an ungrateful immigrant trying to destroy a patriotic officer's career. Through it all, Sarah found strength in unexpected places. Her neighbors, many of whom were immigrants themselves, rallied around her with offers of support and protection. Miguel, initially worried that the publicity might hurt his case, became one of his sister's strongest advocates, speaking to reporters about the courage it took to stand up to systemic discrimination. Thompson faced his own challenges. Some of his colleagues treated him with suspicion and hostility for breaking the blue wall of silence that often protected officers from accountability. His supervisor called him in for several difficult conversations about loyalty and teamwork. But Thompson stood by his decision, telling anyone who would listen that real loyalty meant upholding the oath to protect and serve all people, not covering up misconduct. 3 months after the initial incident, the Inspector General's investigation concluded that Reynolds had indeed violated Sarah's civil rights and had engaged in a pattern of discriminatory behavior toward immigrants and people of color. The report recommended his termination and suggested that the agency implement mandatory bias training for all security personnel. Reynolds was fired, though he immediately began appealing the decision through his union. The agency settled Sarah's civil rights lawsuit for a substantial sum, which she used to establish a legal defense fund for other immigrants facing discrimination. Perhaps most importantly, the case led to policy changes that made it much harder for individual officers to conduct arbitrary searches based on personal bias. New oversight mechanisms were put in place, and the checkpoint where Sarah had been harassed was equipped with additional cameras to ensure accountability. 6 months after that terrible morning at the checkpoint, Sarah returned to the same federal building for Miguel's final immigration hearing. This time, her passage through security was routine and respectful. Thompson, who had been promoted to a supervisory position, partly in recognition of his integrity during the Reynolds investigation, greeted her with a professional nod and a subtle smile. Miguel's case was approved. The judge, noting the community support letters and Miguel's exemplary record, granted him permanent resident status on the spot. As brother and sister emerged from the building together, Sarah felt a deep sense of completion. The fight against Reynolds had been exhausting and sometimes frightening, but it had also been transformative. Sarah had discovered that she possessed a strength she hadn't known existed. A willingness to stand up for principle even when doing so carried significant risks. More importantly, she had learned that America, despite its flaws and the prejudices of some of its citizens, still retained the mechanisms for justice. The system wasn't perfect, but it could still be responsive to moral pressure and legal challenges. Change was possible, even if it required courage from individuals willing to speak truth to power. At a community celebration held in Miguel's honor, Sarah addressed a crowd of neighbors, friends, and supporters who had sustained her through the difficult months of investigation and legal proceedings. "When I first came to this country," she said, "I thought freedom meant the right to work and live without fear. And those things are important. But I've learned that real freedom means having the right to be treated with dignity and the responsibility to demand that same dignity for others." She paused, looking out at faces that reflected the beautiful diversity of her adopted community. Americans by birth and by choice, young and old, representing dozens of countries and cultures but united by shared values of justice and mutual respect. "What happened to me at that checkpoint was wrong," she continued, "but what happened afterward gives me hope. People stood up, people spoke out, people demanded better, and because of that, the next person who walks through that checkpoint will be treated with the respect that every human being deserves." The crowd erupted in applause, but Sarah wasn't finished. "I want to thank Officer Thompson," she said, gesturing toward the young man who stood near the back of the crowd. "He showed that having integrity sometimes means standing up to people in authority, even when it's difficult. He proved that there are still people in uniform who understand that their job is to serve all of us, not just the ones who look like them or talk like them." Thompson stepped forward, clearly moved by the recognition. When he spoke, his voice carried a conviction that had been strengthened by the difficult months of standing up for what was right. "What I did wasn't heroic," he said. "It was just basic human decency. The real hero is Miss Martinez, who had the courage to fight back when it would have been easier to stay quiet. She made all of us better by refusing to accept injustice." As the celebration continued into the evening, Sarah found herself surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by her decision to stand up to Reynolds. There was Maria, an elderly woman who had been inspired to report a discriminatory encounter with a different federal agency. There was David, a young law student who had changed his career focus to immigration law after following Sarah's case. There was Anna, a high school student who had written a prize-winning essay about civil rights inspired by Sarah's example. Each story reminded Sarah that individual acts of courage could ripple outward in ways that were impossible to predict or measure. By standing up for herself, she had inadvertently empowered others to stand up for themselves and for each other. Late that evening, as the celebration wound down and people began to drift home, Sarah found herself alone with Miguel on a bench outside the community center where the party had been held. The siblings sat in comfortable silence, both reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "I was so scared when all this started," Miguel admitted. "I thought your fight with that officer might hurt my case, might give them a reason to deny my application." Sarah nodded. "I was scared too. But I realized that if I didn't stand up for myself, who would? And if people like us don't demand to be treated with dignity, how can we expect anything to change?" Miguel smiled. "You know what I think? I think Mama would be proud of us. We came here looking for safety and opportunity, but we ended up fighting for justice. That's very American, don't you think?" Sarah laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Yes," she said. "I think that's exactly right." As they walked home through streets lit by familiar streetlights, past neighbors' houses where American flags flew alongside flags from dozens of other nations, Sarah reflected on the complicated nature of belonging. She had been tested by Reynolds' hatred and discrimination, but she had also been embraced by Thompson's integrity and her community's support. The checkpoint incident had revealed both the worst and best of American society. There were still people like Reynolds who saw immigrants as threats to be contained rather than neighbors to be welcomed. But there were also people like Thompson who understood that America's strength came from its diversity, and people like Chen who dedicated their careers to protecting the vulnerable. Most importantly, there were ordinary citizens who refused to stand by silently when they witnessed injustice. The woman who had recorded the incident, the man who had taken notes, the demonstrators who had marched for accountability, the neighbors who had offered support during the difficult months of investigation and legal proceedings. Sarah's story had become part of America's ongoing story, a reminder that the country's highest ideals were not self-executing but required constant vigilance and occasional courage from people willing to fight for them. As she unlocked the door to her apartment, Sarah thought about tomorrow. There would be other challenges, other battles to fight, other opportunities to stand up for what was right. But tonight, she was simply grateful to be home, in a country where justice was still possible, with a brother whose future was now secure. The religious medallion that Reynolds had handled so dismissively now hung in a place of honor on Sarah's kitchen wall, next to Miguel's graduation photo and a framed copy of the policy changes that had resulted from her complaint. St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes, watched over a family that had discovered their cause was not lost after all. Outside, the city hummed with the quiet energy of millions of people building their lives, pursuing their dreams, and slowly, imperfectly, but persistently working toward the more perfect union that the founders had envisioned but left for future generations to create.